Court is back in session on this Monday, the 20th of August 2017, on the Global Law Hour. I'm your host, Jonathan Bank, and as time is of the essence, we'll get straight into our topic for today. In the Modern Law Review, the author Khan Freund analyses the difficulty of transplanting legal institutions and the laws of one country into another. He uses a double metaphor of transplants being on one end of a continuum, a mechanical insertion, not unlike the transfer of a wheel or carburetor from one car to another. On the other end of the continuum, a surgical transplant, comparable to the transplant of a kidney or heart, which face all the risks of organ rejection. So he's basically saying that, there's different degrees of legal transferability. The mechanical end representing the most simplistic and the organic end representing the most perilous and likely to fail. So, as international law increasingly crosses domestic and traditional boundaries, there is a need to service a diverse range of legal personnel and clientele. So while the Modern Law Review gave us examples of legal transplantation on a global scale from country to country, today I would like to focus on a more local level. Today we will delve into how comparative law has been used as a tool for legal reform in Australia. So this is specifically how Western law has been applied to Indigenous Australians and why this process is more comparable to a surgical transplant than a mechanical exchange. I feel that Australian lawyers, while having to think globally nowadays, still have to act in a local sense, hence the word global. So we really have two living organisms in Western law and Aboriginal law. For the purposes of the analogy, you the listener, if you could think of the Western law as being the kidney being transplanted into the living body, which is Aboriginal laws and society. So an example where Western law has not been successfully transplanted is in the area of copyright. Terry Janke presented at the Sydney Writers' Festival in 2010, and one of the many examples she gave is that an Indigenous story that is oral is not actually protected by copyright. The consequences of this is that there's no legal requirement for a person to get prior informed consent from the owner of the story to write this story or reproduce that story or use it in another form such as a movie. This work would be protected if it was written down. So I guess it's kind of easy for us to just think, then why don't you just write it down? But really, it isn't that simple. I guess we have to understand that traditional Indigenous stories are the heart of Indigenous identity. These stories were traditionally told by word of mouth to pass on knowledge of important ways of life, and some are even sacred, meaning that not everybody will be privy to that particular story. So there's no protection for these stories, and this is an illustration of a situation we're trying to transplant Western law in terms of copyright law into Aboriginal law and society has failed, or where the body has rejected the transplant. However, it's not all negative. An example where Western law has been successfully transplanted is in the area of Aboriginal land rights. So examples include land rights schemes that are in place in most states in Australia, where area lands have been given back to Indigenous people, and more specifically, the Kenby land case, where the land was given back to the original owners in 2016 after 37 years. However, while this is claimed to be a success at first instance, in New South Wales alone, there are 29,000 Indigenous land claims. It is calculated to take over 90 years to clear these claims. We often think of Australia as a map of 6 states and 2 territories, but Aboriginal Australia actually looks like this on this slide here. As you can see, there are hundreds of tribal nations and groups that have different languages, beliefs, and customs, with some of the borders and groups still being contested to this day. If we were to use our transplant analogy, imagine being a patient waiting for a transplant. Even if there is a transplant out there, if a patient were to die on the waiting list, then there's really not much point for that patient. For Indigenous Australians, if you had to wait for up to 90 years for your case to be heard, I'm not really sure if you would feel that the law is operating all that successfully. I think we include in this case that even if there is a degree of success, attempting to apply Australian law or Western law in this case is certainly not a mechanical exercise, but more akin to a complex transplantation of an organism into a living body. So, possible solutions for the future. So, even within Australia, Religious, linguistic, and cultural differences and cross-cultural assumptions present special challenges for establishing trust and accurate communication. While I don't claim to have all the answers, I think moving forward as a whole, members of the Australian legal system need to interact with the culturally and linguistically diverse range of clients that exists in many ways that form meaningful, trusted relationships and, just basically effective communication. By educating ourselves and immersing ourselves in different cultures, we may be able to better understand the interplay between culture, language, and law. This will also develop the ability to be more self reflective, open minded, and accepting of people that we interact with, as well as more accommodating of the systems and rules that operate within those cultures. Using those strategies, we can hopefully better understand the body that we are transplanting into so that the chances of a successful transplant increase and an appropriate legal solutions are found to their issues. Thank you for listening.